I want to tell you about the day I stood in the rain outside a restaurant I had paid for, looking through the window at my niece sitting across from the woman who had taken everything from me. She was laughing, head thrown back, shoulders shaking, completely at ease. And my niece, the girl I had sacrificed years of my life for. The girl I had written check after check after check for. The girl I had believed in when nobody else did. She was laughing too. I stood there for I don't know how long. The rain soaked through my coat. My phone was in my hand, and I had her number pulled up. Ready to call. Ready to say something. Ready to do anything. But I just stood there. Because in that moment, everything I thought I understood about loyalty, about family, about what it means to sacrifice for someone you love, all of it collapsed. And I realized I had been building my entire emotional life on a foundation that was never as solid as I thought it was. This is that story. And if you've ever given everything to someone who gave it all back to your enemy, you're going to understand every single word of what I'm about to say. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is who I was when it started. I was 41 years old. I had spent the better part of 2 decades working in logistics management. Not glamorous. Not the kind of career people ask about at dinner parties. But steady, honest work that I was good at. I had a small house that I owned outright. I had a savings account that I had built from almost nothing. I had a routine that kept me sane. Coffee at 6. Work by 8. A long walk in the evenings. That helped me decompress from a job that was more people management than anything else. I had been married once, briefly, in my early 30s. It didn't last. No dramatic reason. Just 2 people who wanted different things. And were too young to know how to say it. We parted without much damage on either side. And I had been on my own ever since. I wasn't lonely, though. I want to be clear about that. Because the woman at the center of this story, the one who would eventually use that fact against me, she loved to describe me as lonely. Lonely and desperate for connection. Lonely and therefore easy to manipulate. That was her narrative. And as you'll see, she was very good at making narratives stick. But I wasn't lonely. I had friends. I had colleagues I genuinely liked. I had my routines and my books and my garden. And a life that was quiet in a way that suited me. What I also had was family. And the part of my family that mattered most to me. The part that I had organized a significant portion of my emotional life around. Was my brother Daniel and his daughter. Her name was Kara. Daniel and I had grown up in the same house. Raised by parents who were good people, but not expressive ones. We weren't a family that said, "I love you" easily. We were a family that showed up. You showed up when someone needed help moving. You showed up when someone was sick. You showed up with food when there was a crisis. And you didn't ask what you could do. You just did. That was how we were raised. And Daniel was my closest friend in the world, not just my brother. We talked on the phone almost every Sunday. We had dinner together at least once a month. When I was going through my divorce, he was the first person I called. He came over that same night with a 6-pack of beer and a bag of chips. And we sat on my back porch until 2 in the morning. And he didn't give me advice unless I asked for it. He just sat with me. That's the kind of brother he was. And Kara was the best thing that had ever happened to Daniel. She was born when he was 26, which was young. But Daniel had grown up fast. I was at the hospital the night she was born. I remember holding her when she was maybe 2 hours old. This tiny, furious, red-faced person, who had already decided the world was not living up to her expectations. And I felt something I hadn't expected. Something that felt like I would walk through fire for you. Just like that. Immediate. No conditions. She was 8 months old the first time she grabbed my finger. She was 2 when she started calling me by a nickname she invented herself. Just a mangled version of my name. But it was mine and hers. And she used it until she was in middle school. She was 7 when Daniel's marriage fell apart. His wife, Kara's mother, was a woman named Renata. And I will be honest with you. I had never fully trusted Renata. Not because she was unkind to me. She wasn't. She was perfectly pleasant in that surface-level way that some people are when they've made a private decision. To keep you at arm's length. There was always something just slightly off. A comment that landed wrong. A story that didn't quite add up. A pattern of behavior around money. That Daniel would explain away. And I would file in the back of my mind and say nothing about. Because it wasn't my marriage. Because Daniel was happy, or said he was. Because Kara was thriving, and that was what mattered. When the marriage ended, I found out why I had always been uneasy. Renata had been living a financial double life for the better part of 4 years. She had credit cards Daniel didn't know about. She had debts that ran into the tens of thousands. She had, at one point, taken a loan against the equity of their home. Without forging his signature exactly. She had convinced Daniel to sign paperwork he didn't fully read. Telling him it was refinancing paperwork that would lower their monthly payments. It wasn't. It was a home equity line of credit that she proceeded to drain. When Daniel found out, it wasn't through any dramatic confrontation. It was through a letter. An official letter from a collections agency. About an account he had never heard of. With his name on it. He called me that Sunday. And for the first time in our adult lives, I heard my brother cry. The divorce was brutal. Not in a screaming, throwing things way. In a slow, grinding, paperwork way. That is somehow worse. It took 14 months. It cost him more money than he had. It cost him the house. The house he and Kara had lived in since she was 3. The house with the backyard where I had pushed her on the swing set. For years. The house that smelled like her childhood. He moved into a small apartment across town. Kara split her time between them. Which meant she split her time between a cramped 2-bedroom apartment. Where Daniel was clearly struggling. And whatever arrangement Renata had set up. Which changed every few months. Because Renata was not, it turned out, a woman with a stable plan. I want to stop here and make sure you understand something. What I'm about to tell you. The years of sacrifice. The checks I wrote. The phone calls. The emotional labor. I did not do any of it because I wanted something in return. I did it because Kara was my blood. I did it because Daniel needed help. And I had the means to help. And in my family. You show up. I want you to hold on to that. Because the woman who would later weaponize all of it. Who would build an entire case on the idea that I was controlling. That I had strings attached. That my generosity was really just a power play. She understood exactly how to twist the truth. Into something unrecognizable. And she had years to work on Kara. Years I didn't see coming. Kara was 12 when the divorce finalized. She was 12 and she was struggling. Her grades had slipped. Her teacher called Daniel twice in one semester about behavior changes. Not anything serious. Just a girl who had withdrawn. Who used to raise her hand and now sat with her eyes on the desk. Who used to laugh easily and now seemed to be carrying something heavy. Daniel told me all of this on one of our Sunday calls. And I asked him what he needed. He said he didn't know. I said, tell me what Kara needs. He said, she needs to feel like her future is still okay. She was 12 years old, and she had somehow absorbed the idea that the financial collapse of her parents' marriage meant her future was in jeopardy. She had heard things she shouldn't have heard. She had found a letter once, she told me this years later. A letter from the bank about her father's credit score. And she hadn't understood all of it. But she understood enough to be scared. So I called her. Not Daniel, Kara. And I said, I need you to listen to me for a minute. Your dad is going to be okay. And you are going to be okay. And when the time comes for college, whatever you want to study, wherever you want to go, I will make sure you get there. I promise you that. Okay. She was quiet for a moment. And then she said, you promise. And I said, I promise. That was the promise. That was where all of it began. I want to be clear about what I was committing to, because what I was not doing was making a vague gesture of emotional support. I meant it literally. I had already decided, by the time I made that phone call, that I would fund Kara's college education. All of it. Whatever she needed. Whatever school she got into. Whatever the gap was between financial aid and reality. I would close it. Because I could. Because she deserved it. Because watching my brother rebuild from financial ruin, while trying to keep his daughter's spirits up, was one of the most painful things I had ever witnessed. And this was something concrete I could do. I told Daniel afterward. He argued with me for 40 minutes. He said he couldn't let me. He said it wasn't right. He said he would find another way. I let him talk. And then I said, Daniel, you would do it for me. Don't make this into something complicated. He went quiet. And then he said, I don't know how to thank you for this. I said, don't thank me, just help her get there. I did not tell Renata. That decision would later be used against me in ways I couldn't have predicted. The years between Kara's middle school and her high school graduation were some of the best years of my relationship with her. I know that sounds strange, given everything that comes after. But it's true. She grew into herself during those years in a way that was extraordinary to watch. The withdrawn girl who sat with her eyes on her desk became someone electric. She was curious about everything. She devoured books. Not just assigned reading, but books she found herself. Books she'd bring to family dinners and quote from at the table. In a way that made Daniel beam with a pride he tried to keep casual. She was funny. Not in a performing way. In a sharp, dry, unexpected way. That would catch you off guard and make you laugh before you realized it. She had opinions. Strong ones. She argued positions with her whole chest. And then, and this is the part that impressed me most, she was capable of changing her mind when someone gave her a good enough reason. That kind of intellectual flexibility in a teenager is rare. She was also perceptive. Sometimes uncomfortably so. She would say things that cut straight to the center of a situation that adults around her had been dancing around for weeks. I loved that about her. I loved her. Not in a sentimental, abstract way. In a specific, daily, real way. That meant I thought about how she was doing. Even when we hadn't spoken in a week. We talked often. Not just on family occasions, regularly. She would text me about things she was reading. She would call me to argue about something she'd heard in the news. When she was 16, she called me at 9 in the evening. Because she'd had a fight with Renata. And she needed to talk it through with someone. Who wasn't her dad. Because she was worried about how it would affect him. That call lasted 2 hours. And somewhere in the middle of it she said, "You're the person in my family who makes the most sense to me." I held on to that. I held on to it for years. And eventually, Renata would hold on to it too. In a very different way. Renata. I have to talk about Renata now. Because up until Kara's sophomore year of high school, Renata was largely background noise in my life. She was Kara's mother. She was Daniel's ex-wife. She had done terrible things to my brother financially. And I had not forgiven her for that. But I had compartmentalized it. Because Kara needed her mother. And I was not going to be the person who complicated that relationship. I was cordial at events. I was neutral on the phone with Kara when the subject came up. I never, not once, said anything negative about Renata to her daughter. That restraint would cost me more than I understood at the time. Because Renata had no equivalent restraint about me. The first sign came from an unexpected direction. Kara was 15. We were at my house for a Sunday dinner. Just the three of us, me, Daniel, and Kara. And she said something offhand. She said, "Mom says you pay for stuff because it makes you feel powerful." She said it lightly. The way teenagers repeat things they've heard. Without fully understanding what they're carrying. Daniel went very still. I kept my face neutral and said, "Is that what you think?" And she looked at me, that sharp, perceptive look. And she said, "No, I think you do it because you love us." I said, "Then that's what matters." And we moved on. But I did not forget it. Because that sentence, "It makes you feel powerful," that was not a 15-year-old's observation. That was Renata's language. Renata was putting a frame around my generosity. She was doing it quietly. She was doing it through her daughter. And she was doing it in a way that gave her total deniability. Because she hadn't said it to me. She'd said it to Kara. And Kara, to her credit at 15, had rejected it. But the seed had been planted. And Renata, as I would eventually understand, was a very patient gardener. I want to tell you about the first time I truly understood what I was dealing with. Kara was 17. She had just received her acceptance letter from a state university that had a strong program in environmental science, which had been her passion since freshman year. She called me before she called Daniel. I remember exactly where I was, sitting at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, when my phone rang and I heard her voice, before she'd even finished saying hello, already shaking with the kind of happiness that's so big it almost sounds like something else. She said, "I got in." I said, "I know you would." She said, "I got in, I got in, I got in." And we laughed together. And she cried a little. And then she said, "Are you still, is the offer still?" I said, "Kara, yes, without question, yes." She exhaled like she had been holding that breath for years. And she had. I had no idea how much she had. I called Daniel that evening. He already knew. Kara had called him right after me. He said she was so happy she couldn't eat dinner. He said she had read the letter out loud to him 3 times. He said, "This is because of you, you need to know that." I said, "It's because of her." He said, "Both." There was a pause and then he said, "Renata's been telling her she should apply for more financial aid. Try to fund it herself. Not take your money." I said, "Okay." He said, "Kara's not listening to her. But I thought you should know." I thanked him for telling me. I hung up the phone and I sat for a while. And I thought about what that meant. Renata didn't want Kara to take my money. Not because she had a better option. Not because she had savings put aside for this. She didn't. Not because financial aid was going to cover it. It wasn't, not fully. She didn't want Kara to take my money. Because Kara taking my money meant Kara owing me something. Not financially. Emotionally. Renata understood, probably better than I did. That generosity creates bonds. That gratitude, real gratitude, ties people together. And she did not want her daughter tied to me. Because Kara tied to me was Kara potentially tied to Daniel. And Kara tied to Daniel was Kara having a version of the family story. That didn't center Renata. I understood this. And I did not let it stop me. Because Kara's future was more important than Renata's narrative. I believed that then. I still believe it. Kara started university in September of that year. And I want to describe for you what that first year looked like. Because I need you to understand that this was not a transaction. This was a relationship. I paid the tuition. I paid the housing fees. I set up a monthly transfer to her bank account to cover food and incidentals. Not a lavish amount. Just enough that she could eat well and not panic about every dollar. I flew out to see her twice that first year. Once in October when she was homesick in a way she wouldn't admit to Daniel. Because she didn't want him to worry. And once in March when she had her first real academic crisis. A research project that had gone sideways. A professor who had given her feedback she didn't understand how to apply. A quiet, grinding panic that she managed to describe to me at 2 in the morning. Over a video call. I didn't solve it for her. That's important. I listened. I asked questions. I helped her think through it. And at the end of the call she said, "Thank you, I feel like I can actually do this now." And she could. And she did. She finished that first year with a GPA that made Daniel cry at dinner. There were warning signs in that first year that I noticed. and chose to interpret generously. I am going to be honest about that. Kara came home for Christmas. We had dinner at Daniel's. His apartment was small, but he had learned to cook well in the years since the divorce. And he made a roast that filled the whole place with a smell. That felt like something from before everything fell apart. Kara was present, but somewhere slightly else. It was subtle. The kind of thing you'd only notice if you'd been paying attention to someone for years. She checked her phone more than usual. She answered questions fully, but didn't expand on them the way she usually did. She laughed at the right moments, but a beat late. I thought, she's adjusting to being home after months away. That's normal. I did not think she's been having conversations I don't know about. I did not think someone is already working on her. I chose the generous interpretation. I was wrong too. The summer after her first year, she came home for 3 months. She spent most of it with her friends, which was healthy and appropriate. But she also spent time with Renata. More time than she had in high school. I heard this from Daniel, who mentioned it without comment. In the careful way, he mentioned anything that touched on Renata, letting me draw my own conclusions. I asked Kara about it once lightly. How's your mom doing? She said, good, we've been spending a lot of time together, it's been nice. She said it with a warmth that was slightly defensive. Not because I challenged her. Just because she anticipated that I might. That defensiveness told me more than the words did. She had already categorized me, in some corner of her mind, as someone who would have an opinion about her spending time with Renata. I hadn't given her that categorization. Someone had. Second year of university. This is where the tone shifted. Not dramatically. Not in any way I could point to and say, that was the moment. It was a series of small things. The text slowed down. Not stopped, slowed. Where before she would message me articles, thoughts, half-formed opinions. Now the messages were shorter. More status update. Less connection. The video calls moved from once or twice a week to once every few weeks. And when we did talk, there was something careful in how she spoke about her life. Like she was editing. Like she was giving me a version of things. I told myself, she's growing up. She's building her own life. This is what you want for people you love. You want them to need you less. But it didn't feel like independence. It felt like distance that had a direction to it. Like she was moving toward something. Or someone. Then came the phone call that cracked everything open. It was a Tuesday in March of her second year. She called me, which was unusual. She usually texted first. And she sounded like she was choosing her words very carefully. She said, I want to talk to you about something. I said, of course, what's up? She said, Mom told me some things about the arrangement. About the money. And I want to understand your perspective. I said, what did she tell you? And she said, in a voice that was trying very hard to be neutral. She said that you've been using the money to control Dad. That the way you helped us was a way of keeping Dad dependent on you. And that it's affected how Dad sees her. How the whole family sees her. I was quiet for a long moment. And then I said, Kara, your mother lost your father's home. She took money from your family for years without his knowledge. I helped because he had nothing left and you deserved a future. That's the whole story. And she said you'd say that. That sentence. She said you'd say that. That was the moment I understood. That this was not a conversation I was walking into unprepared. This was a conversation I had already lost. After that call, I did something I had never done before in my relationship with Kara. I asked Daniel what was happening. Directly. No buffer, no softening. I called him that same evening and I said, what do you know about what Renata has been saying to Kara? There was a pause. The kind of pause that tells you the person has been waiting for this question and has been dreading it at the same time. He said, how much do you want to know? I said, all of it. And he told me. What Daniel described was not a single conversation. It was a campaign. It had apparently started in Kara's freshman year, during a visit home in late October. A visit I hadn't known about because Kara hadn't mentioned it. Renata had taken her to dinner. Just the two of them. And over that dinner she had, according to Daniel, who had heard pieces of it from Kara over the following months, begun what I can only describe as a systematic reframing. She didn't attack me directly. That would have been too obvious, and Kara would have resisted. Instead, she asked questions. Leading questions. Don't you find it a little strange that your aunt is so involved in everything? Has she ever made you feel like you owe her? Do you think she would still be as close to you and your dad if she wasn't helping financially? Questions designed not to give Kara an answer, but to make Kara build the answer herself. Because a conclusion you reach on your own is one you'll defend much harder than one someone handed you. Renata understood this instinctively. She had been working this angle for a year, before Kara ever asked me for my perspective. Daniel said Kara had not fully believed it at first. He said she had pushed back. He said she had, on at least one occasion, defended me to her mother directly. But Renata was patient, and she kept adding layers. Layer 1, my motivations. Layer 2, the impact on Daniel. Your dad can't make a financial decision without checking with her first. Is that healthy for a grown man? Which was not remotely true. Daniel consulted me because I had more financial experience, and he consulted me by choice. And I had never once told him what to do. But Renata wasn't interested in accuracy. She was interested in the image she was painting. And the image was a controlling woman who had inserted herself into a family that was not entirely hers, who held the purse strings as a form of power, whose generosity was really a leash. Layer 3, my relationship with Kara specifically. She calls you so often, have you ever asked yourself why? Is it because she loves you? Or because she knows you're the one with the money? Which, if Kara entertained that thought for even 30 seconds, would retroactively poison every warm memory we had. Every call, every laugh, every conversation, all of it recolored, with the possibility that it had been transactional on Kara's side. That is a devastating thing to do to a young woman who genuinely loved the person being described. Because if Kara started to suspect that her love for me had been influenced by financial gratitude, she would feel ashamed. And in her shame, she would pull away. Not because she stopped loving me, but because she couldn't look at the love clearly anymore. Renata had not created distance between us. She had created doubt. And doubt, in a relationship built on emotional closeness, is a far more efficient weapon. By the time Daniel finished telling me this, I had been sitting at my kitchen table for over an hour. I hadn't moved. I had barely spoken. When he stopped, I said, "How long have you known this?" He said, "Some of it a while." I didn't know how bad it was until recently. I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And he said something that was honest and painful. Because I was afraid of what would happen if I did. She's caught in the middle of this. She loves you. I know she does. But she also needs her mother. And if I say something, I become the one who made it worse. I understood that. I didn't like it. But I understood it. I want to tell you what I did next. Because I think it matters for how you understand what kind of person I was trying to be throughout this. I did not call Kara back immediately. I did not call Renata. I did not do anything reactive. I sat with it for 3 days. And then I called Kara. And I said, "I want to talk to you. Not to defend myself, but because I think you deserve to hear how I see things. And then whatever you decide to believe is yours to decide." She agreed. We had a long conversation. I told her the truth of why I had made the offer when she was 12. I told her about the letter from the bank that her dad had found. I told her that I had never, not once, used the money as leverage. Not over Daniel, not over her. I told her that if she wanted to stop accepting it, if it made her uncomfortable in any way, I would stop the moment she asked. She was quiet for a long time. And then she said, "I know you mean that." I said, "Do you believe it?" She said, "I'm trying to." I said, "That's enough." And I thought we had turned a corner. I thought the conversation had cut through the layer of doubt. I thought Kara was strong enough and perceptive enough. And she was both. To see through what her mother was doing. I was wrong. Not about Kara. About Renata. Because Renata hadn't finished. Junior year. Kara's third year. This is where the external dimension entered the story. And this is where, in retrospect, I understand that everything had been building toward this. That the campaign against me in Kara's mind was preparation for a much larger move. I need to backtrack slightly to tell you something. I had been keeping out of this story. Because it was a part of my life, I was not ready to revisit. The family member who destroyed my life. I've been referring to Renata in abstract terms. As the ex-wife, as the financial saboteur. But the full picture of what Renata had done to my family went beyond the marriage. When the divorce finalized and the debt came to light, a full accounting of Renata's financial history was done. And in that accounting was something Daniel almost hadn't shown me. A loan. A loan taken against an investment account. An account that did not belong only to Daniel. An account that was a joint investment that he and I had opened together. 7 years earlier, a modest thing. A long-term plan. Money we had both put in over years. With no immediate purpose. Beyond the vague understanding that it was something for the future. The account had required both our signatures to open. But it had been set up in Daniel's name primarily. For administrative simplicity. Renata had found documentation of this account. She had forged Daniel's signature on a form. That reclassified it as a sole owner account. And then she had borrowed against it. She had taken $42,000. That half belonged to me. She had taken it. She had spent it. And she had never said a word. I found out during the divorce proceedings. I found out through a financial document that a lawyer was using to establish the total scope of the marital debt. I found out because Daniel called me, barely able to form sentences, and said, "She took your money too. Your half. It's gone." I will not describe what that period was like in full. Because this story is about Kara. Not about Renata's crimes. But you need to know that I pursued legal action. I hired an attorney. It took 2 years. It cost me money and legal fees. That made back only a fraction of what had been taken. I collected a judgment. I never collected the money. Because Renata, it turned out, was exceptionally skilled at making her assets difficult to trace. She never paid me. She was ordered to. She never did. And there was a limit to what I could reasonably continue to pursue, without it consuming my life entirely. So I stopped. I took the loss. I filed it under. Things that happened. Things that cost me. Things I had to move forward from. And I moved forward. What I did not anticipate was that Renata would use my legal action against her. As the final piece of the story she was telling Kara. In Kara's junior year, something shifted in the texture of our relationship that I can only describe as a closing. Like a window shutting. Still visible through the glass. But sealed. The calls that had been weekly, then bi-weekly, now became monthly. When we spoke, she was kind. She asked about my life. She answered questions about hers. But the intimacy was gone. The thing that had made our relationship feel like a friendship as much as a family bond. The comfortable, unedited ease of it had been replaced by something careful and cordial. She felt like someone following a script that said, "Be warm. Be appropriate. Give nothing away." I raised it once. I said, "You feel far away lately. Is everything okay?" She said, "I'm fine, just busy. 3rd year is a lot." I said, "Okay." But it wasn't that. We both knew it wasn't that. At Christmas of her junior year, I found out through Daniel. Third hand, through a friend of his who knew Renata's sister. What Renata had been telling people in the extended family. Not just Kara. Everyone. She had been telling a version of events, in which I was the villain. In this version, I had used my financial control of Daniel to influence the divorce proceedings. In this version, I had hired a lawyer not to recover money that was rightfully mine, but to harass her, to punish her for leaving my brother. In this version, I had attempted to use Kara's college funding as leverage, to keep Kara away from her mother. None of this was true. None of it had any basis in reality. But it was told so consistently, to so many people, with such specific, false detail, specific dollar amounts, specific dates, specific accusations, that it had the texture of truth. People who had never had reason to question Renata had no framework to disbelieve her, and several of them believed her. My aunt called me. She had heard the version. She said carefully, trying to be fair, "I want to hear your side." I told her. She said, "I believe you." But I could hear in her voice the hesitation. That comes from having two competing stories, and not enough evidence to fully commit to either. My mother had been gone for 6 years by this point. She died when Daniel and I were in our mid-30s. Or this would have reached her. I was grateful in that moment that it hadn't. But I also felt, in that same moment, something I had not let myself feel in years. I felt alone. Not lonely. I'd said I wasn't lonely, and I meant it. But alone in the specific sense of, the person who should be defending me is not here. And the person who could defend me most effectively is the one being used as a weapon against me. Kara. Kara who knew me. Kara who had said I was the person in her family who made the most sense. Kara who had been inside our relationship for 20 years and knew the truth of what it was. If she spoke, it would matter. If she said what she knew, not just to me, but to the family, it would cut through the narrative. But she wasn't speaking. She was doing the thing that I would only fully understand later. She was choosing. And she hadn't finished choosing. Kara graduated in May. 4 years. She had done it in 4 years, on time with honors. A distinction that her department awarded to fewer than 15% of graduates. The ceremony was on a Saturday. Daniel and I drove out together. It was a 4-hour drive, and we talked about everything and nothing. The way you do when you're happy and nervous at the same time. When you're about to arrive at a moment you've been holding in your mind for years. We talked about the first time we'd driven Kara to orientation. We talked about the research paper she'd published as a junior. A real publication, a real journal. That had made me so proud I'd told strangers about it. We talked about what came next for her. A position with an environmental consultancy. An entry-level role that was genuinely competitive to land. That she had won on her own merit, without anyone making a call on her behalf. We did not talk about Renata. We never talked about Renata in that way. In the planning, anticipating way. We should have. Renata was there. Of course she was Kara's mother, and I had not expected her not to be. We acknowledged each other. A nod. The minimum. Kara walked across that stage in the afternoon sun. And I thought, whatever else has happened, this moment is real. Whatever is coming, this exists. She did this. I was part of helping her get here. And that is not nothing. That can't be taken. The dinner after the ceremony was at a restaurant nearby. One of those places that fills up with graduation parties every May. Loud and warm and slightly chaotic. Daniel had made the reservation months in advance. It was supposed to be the 3 of us. It turned into 6. Renata came. Renata's sister came. And a woman I had never met, who was introduced to me as a family friend of Renata's. A woman named Sable, who, I would later understand, was not a family friend at all, but rather the person Renata had been conducting most of her campaign through. The table dynamic was immediately strange. Renata sat next to Kara. I was at the other end. Daniel was between us, which meant he was also between everything. The conversation moved in two streams. One around me and Daniel. One around Kara and Renata's end. And they rarely crossed. Kara was pleasant to me. She thanked me, briefly and formally, for my support. She said she was grateful. She said it the way you'd thank a distant colleague. For covering your shift. Not the way you'd thank the person who had made the last 4 years of your life possible. Daniel noticed. I saw him notice. He said nothing because there was nothing to say in that room. I went to the bathroom at some point during the meal. When I came back, the table had shifted. Renata was speaking, I could tell by the posture at the table. The slight forward lean of everyone listening. And when she saw me, she stopped. Not guiltily. Calmly. In the way that someone stops who is saying something. And is not worried about you knowing they were saying something. She looked at me with a small, composed smile. And she said, we were just talking about next steps. Kara has some big decisions ahead. I sat down. I smiled back. And I thought, this is not over. Whatever she was building toward, we are not at the end. 3 weeks after graduation. I know the exact day because I was at my kitchen table when my phone lit up. A Saturday morning, June 15th. And I saw Kara's name. Not a call. A text. 6 lines. I'm going to read them to you, as close to exactly as I can remember. Because I have read them so many times. They are embedded in me now. She wrote, I've been thinking about how to say this for a long time. I love you and I'm grateful for everything. But I've also been doing a lot of work on myself. And I've come to understand that our relationship has had some unhealthy dynamics that I need space from. I'm not cutting you out of my life. But I need some distance to figure out what I want my family relationships to look like going forward. I hope you can respect that. 6 lines. After 20 years. After $42,000 taken from me. After 4 more years of tuition, housing, living expenses. Numbers I had never tabulated. Because I had not wanted it to be about numbers. After 2 trips to see her. After the 2 a.m. phone calls. After 20 years of showing up in every way I knew how. 6 lines. Unhealthy dynamics. Space. Figure out what I want my family relationships to look like. I want to tell you what I did. Because this is the part of the story that I have the most complicated feelings about. I did not respond immediately. I put the phone down. I went outside. I stood in my garden for about 20 minutes. And I just looked at it. The beds I'd planted over years. The order of it. The way growth works. Slowly, incrementally, mostly invisible. Until one day you look up and something has changed. And I thought about the 12-year-old girl who had needed to believe her future was okay. I thought about the promise I had made. I thought about whether I was proud of who I had been in every interaction with Kara. And the answer was yes. Not perfectly. Nobody is perfect. But yes, I had loved her without conditions. I had given without strings. I had held my tongue about her mother. 1,000 times when I didn't want to. I had been the thing I promised her I would be. And I was not going to let this text message rewrite that. Not for anyone. I wrote back 2 sentences. I said, I respect your need for space. I love you and that won't change. That was it. I did not defend myself. I did not catalog what I had done. I did not give her the reaction that I would realize later was the one Renata had told her to expect. Because Renata had told Kara that I would respond to rejection with control. That I would remind her of the money. That I would make her feel guilty. That I would prove, by my reaction, that my generosity had always been conditional. I gave her none of that. I gave her 2 sentences. And then I sat with the worst of it. The worst of it was not the text. The worst came 4 weeks later. When I went to pick up a prescription at a pharmacy. In the neighborhood adjacent to mine. A pharmacy I used occasionally when my usual one was out of something. And I saw them through the window of a restaurant. Kara, and Renata, and Sable, sitting at a table I could see clearly from the sidewalk. Laughing. The three of them. Kara with her head thrown back. Completely at ease. The way she used to look at our dinner table. The way she used to look when we were together. I stood on that sidewalk in the rain. And I remembered the beginning of this story. Because this is where we started. This is the image I led you in with. The rain soaking through my coat. My phone in my hand with her number pulled up. And me not moving. I did not go in. I did not call her. I stood there until I had fully understood what I was seeing. Not just literally, but structurally. What I was seeing was the completion of something. That had taken years to build. Renata had not just told Kara a story. She had replaced me in the story. The seat at the table that had been mine. The seat of the person who made sense. Who showed up. Who held space for the difficult conversations. Renata had put Sable in it. A woman who had never met Kara before graduation. A woman who had no history with her. But who came prepackaged with Renata's narrative. And none of my complicating reality. I was the controlling aunt. Sable was the mentor. I was the financier with strings attached. Sable was the friend with nothing to prove. It was elegant in the awful way that devastating things can be. I walked home in the rain. And that night, I sat at my kitchen table. And for the first time in this whole story, the whole long arc of it, I cried. Not for what I had given. Not for the money. For the girl who used to call me when she was scared. For the girl who said I was the person in her family who made the most sense. For the relationship that had been real. I know it was real. I was there. And had been taken apart piece by piece. By a woman with patience and precision and no conscience. About the damage she was doing to her own daughter. In service of a grudge. Because that's what it was. Renata did not do this to protect Kara. She did it because I had supported my brother. She did it because I had pursued the money she stole. She did it because I was the person who had stood between her and the complete unraveling of my brother's life. And she could not touch me directly. So she took away the thing she knew would hurt most. I want to be careful here about what I mean by justice. Because this is not a story about revenge in the way you might imagine. I did not execute a plan. I did not orchestrate a public humiliation. I did not contact Kara's employer or interfere in her life. I am not that person. And honestly, she wouldn't thank me for it. And she would be right not to. What happened was quieter than revenge. And in some ways, much more lasting. 2 months after the text message, I wrote a letter. A physical letter. Not to Kara. Not yet. To Daniel. I told him everything. Not the parts he already knew. But the parts I had been protecting him from. The full scope of what I had observed. The campaign. The layers. The systematic way Renata had worked on Kara. The night I saw them through the restaurant window. I wrote it not to make him angry. Though he had every right to be. But because he was Kara's father. And he needed to know what had happened to his daughter. As completely as I understood it. I also wrote it because I was afraid. Not for myself. For Kara. Because a person who has been successfully separated from everyone. Who loves them honestly. Separated by design, by a calculated campaign. Is a person who is now alone with the one who orchestrated that separation. And I knew what Renata did with proximity. I knew what she did when she had exclusive access. I was afraid of what she was going to do with Kara's trust. Now that she had secured it entirely. Daniel called me the same evening the letter arrived. He had driven to a parking lot to call me. I could hear the stillness around him. He said, "I've been watching it. I didn't see all of it. But I've been watching it." He said, "I've been afraid to say anything to Kara. Because I didn't want to be the reason she pulled away from me too." I said, "I know." He said, "I don't know what to do." I said, "I don't either. But I think we start by being honest with her. Not to force her hand. Not to make her choose. Just honest. The way we've always been. He said, she's not talking to me the same way either. I hadn't known that. I let it sit. Then I said, she's going to figure this out. She's too smart not to. We just have to make sure we haven't done anything. That gives Renata ammunition. We have to be exactly who we are. 6 months passed. I did not reach out to Kara in that time. I respected the space she asked for. It was one of the hardest things I have ever done. There are people in my life who told me I should fight. Who said I should call her, show up, demand the conversation. And I understood that impulse. But I also understood Kara. She was not someone who could be pushed. She was someone who reached conclusions on her own timeline. She had rejected easy answers her whole life. She was not going to accept easy answers now. Not mine, not her mother's. If I gave her the space to actually look at what she was living, what I had to believe was that the years of real relationship, the texture of 20 years of actual love, would eventually stand out against the background of what Renata had built, which was a structure with no foundation. A story held together by repetition and isolation, not by truth. In November of that year, 6 months after the text, 5 months after the restaurant window, Kara called. No text first. Just a call. I answered on the second ring. She said, hi. I said, hi. She said, can we talk? I said, yes. There was a silence that stretched for long enough that I thought the call had dropped. And then she said, I need to tell you something. And I need you to know that it's hard for me to say. Because I've spent a lot of time being wrong about things. And it's a really uncomfortable place to stand. I said, I know that place well. She said, I think I know that I was unfair to you. And I've been trying to understand how I got there. And the more I understand it, the worse I feel about it. Not just for you. For myself. Because I think I let someone turn me into a version of myself that I don't actually recognize. I let her talk. She talked for a long time. She told me about conversations with Renata that she now saw differently. She told me about the way Sable had been introduced. Not as a family friend, but as someone Renata had described as someone who really understands what we've been through as a family. A person pre-primed to validate a specific narrative. She told me about a night when she had tried to push back, had tried to say something positive about me. And Renata had cried. Not argued. Cried. In a way that made Kara feel that any defense of me was an attack on her mother. She said, I've spent my whole life trying not to hurt her. Because she was always so fragile in those moments. And I think I let that become a leash. And I didn't see it. I said, you were taught not to see it. She said, yes. I am going to be honest about what happened next. It was not a clean reconciliation. It was not a scene from a movie where two people hug. And the music swells. And everything is resolved in the warmth of forgiveness. It was a real conversation between two real people who had been through something real. She apologized. Fully. Without deflection. She said, I'm sorry for the text. I'm sorry for the distance. I'm sorry for the 3 years. Because it was building for 3 years, I can see that now. That I wasn't being honest with you or with myself. I said, I accept that. And I meant it. Not lightly. Not as a formality. As a real decision I was making. Because holding that apology at arm's length would have meant holding her at arm's length. And I was done with distance. She also asked me something I didn't expect. She said, were you angry at me? Not at my mom, at me. I thought about it honestly. I said, yes. Not for long. But yes. Because you are smart enough to have seen it earlier. And I think part of you did. And I think you chose the easier thing because it was easier. And that cost us time. And I won't pretend it didn't. She said, that's fair. I said, but I also know what you were up against. And I know how long it had been going on. And I know that the person who did this to you was supposed to be the person who protected you. So yes, I was angry. And yes, I forgive you. Both things are true. What happened with Renata? This is the part people always want to know. Here is what happened. Renata did not get a dramatic confrontation. She did not get a scene. What she got was this. Kara started talking to Daniel again. Really talking. The way she used to. And as she did, the story she had been carrying, Renata's story, began to be stress-tested against Daniel's actual memory, against his recollection, against the documents, against the facts. And one by one, the specific claims fell apart. The accusations about me controlling the divorce proceedings. Daniel had records, a lawyer had records. The accusations about the money being a power play. Daniel had every text message I'd ever sent him about it. Every one of them the opposite of controlling. The accusation that I had used the college funding as leverage. Kara herself knew this was not true. She had lived it. Nobody had ever asked anything of her. And Renata's story, which had been so detailed, so specific, so convincing, began to look like what it was. A very skilled performance. With no receipts. Kara confronted her mother. I was not there for it. I do not know exactly what was said. What I know is what Kara told me afterward. That Renata had cried. That Renata had accused Kara of being manipulated by me. That Renata had said the conversation was an attack. That Renata had ultimately left the room. And Kara had let her go. Not in anger. In a kind of tired clarity. That only comes from finally seeing something. You can't unsee. She told me I don't hate her. She's my mom. I understand that she was scared of losing me. I understand that she probably believes some version of this. But I can't be in a relationship. That requires me to see you and Dad as villains. Because you're not. And I know that. And I can't keep pretending otherwise. There are things I lost in this story that I will not get back. 3 years of closeness with Kara. That were replaced by something careful and distant. The easy intimacy of the way she used to call me. Without needing a reason. The trust I had before it was tested. Those things don't fully restore. Even in repair. There is scar tissue. And scar tissue, while strong, is not the same as original skin. I want to be honest about that. Because I think people need to hear it. Reconciliation is real. It happened. Kara and I rebuilt something. Are still rebuilding it. That is true and warm and mine. But rebuilt and never damaged are not the same thing. And anyone who tells you they are has never had to do the work of rebuilding. The money I spent on her education. More than $120,000 over 4 years. She has never offered to repay it, and I have never asked. That was not what it was about. And she knows that now. She told me once, about a year after our reconciliation. I think about that money sometimes. Not as a debt. But as evidence. Of what you were to me before everything got complicated. And what you were willing to be even when it was. I didn't know what to say. So I said, it was never about the money. She said, I know. I think that's what makes it mean so much. Renata, as far as I know, has not changed. She is still telling her version of events to whoever will listen. There are still people in the extended family who have heard her story and not mine. There are still family gatherings I am not invited to. Because the version of me that exists in their minds is Renata's version. I have made peace with that. Not comfortably. Not without grief. But peace. Because the alternative. Chasing every person Renata has reached. Fighting every lie she has told. Spending the rest of my life in the war she started. Is not a life I want to live. And I have better things to spend myself on. I have Kara. I have Daniel. I have my house and my garden and my routine. And a relationship with my niece. That was tested by the worst kind of deliberate damage. And survived it. Not intact. But alive. And alive is enough. If you have been where I have been. If someone you sacrificed for has turned away. If someone has been worked on until they saw you wrong. If you have stood in the rain outside a window, watching someone you love laugh with your enemy. I want to say something to you. The love you gave was real. It doesn't stop being real because it was rejected. It doesn't stop being real because someone built a story around it. That made it look like something other than what it was. The relationship you built. The calls, the presents, the times you showed up. Those happened. They are in the person's body somewhere. They do not disappear because a narrative was built over them. They are the foundation. And foundations do not require acknowledgement to hold. They hold because they were built right. Yours was built right. Hold on to that. And if you are the person on the other side, the Kara in this story, the one who believed a version and then had to unbuild it, I want to say this. It takes courage to be wrong. Real courage. The courage to look at what you chose to believe and say, I was used. I was given a story that served someone else's agenda. And I accepted it. That is not a comfortable thing to live in. But it is the beginning of something true. And truth, even the hard kind, is always better than a comfortable lie that requires you to keep the people who actually love you standing in the rain. Thank you for listening. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Shattered Loyalties, because there are more of these. More real people. More impossible family math. More stories that deserve to be told and need to be heard. Leave a comment below if any part of this reflected your life. I read every single one. And sometimes, just knowing you're not alone is the thing that starts to make it bearable.